They called it boldly going where no one had gone before. What they didn't say was that some of those places would get the show banned. There's a scene buried in the archives of 1968 television that television executives still argue about. Two officers, forced together by alien captors, lean in and kiss. It lasts 3 seconds. It ends a career for no one, sparks no scandal in most American households. And yet, an ocean away, an entire national broadcaster decides the world isn't ready to see it. Not because of the kiss, because of what the kiss represented. That's the paradox sitting at the heart of Star Trek's history. A show about the future kept getting punished for looking too far ahead. Heads explode on 1980s television in ways practical effects had never dared attempt. Children who are secretly 300 years old die of a plague their own parents created. A decorated war hero loses his mind so completely he starts murdering prisoners just to prove he can. These weren't accidents of bad taste. They were deliberate, and audiences, decades later, still feel the sting. So let's go back and find out exactly what got cut, what got delayed, and what got banned outright. Because once you see the reasons, you'll understand why this franchise became something more than science fiction. Here's what's easy to forget about Star Trek. It was never supposed to be safe. Gene Roddenberry didn't sell network executives on a show about racism, war, or sexual identity. He sold them a Western in space. Cowboys in frontier towns, dressed up in silver jumpsuits. Privately, though, he was chasing something closer to satire, the kind where you smuggle a difficult truth inside an adventure story so cleverly that nobody in the room stops you until it's already aired. Put the uncomfortable topic on a distant planet. Give it alien skin, and executives who would never approve a script about American racism in 1966 would wave through a story about two warring alien races who happen to be black on one side of their face and white on the other. It worked for a while, and then it worked too well. Because once you build a show designed to smuggle dangerous ideas past the censors, eventually the censors catch on, and when they do, they don't just cut a scene. They pull the whole episode. Start with the quiet one. On a planet that looks exactly like small-town Earth, frozen somewhere in the fading light of the 1960s, the crew beams down expecting silence and finds something worse. A man attacks them, collapses mid-seizure, and dies in front of them before anyone can explain why. Then comes a girl. She's frightened, she's alone, and she calls the crew grups, her word for grown-ups, spoken like a slur. She and the other children left alive on this planet call themselves the onlys, because everyone else, every adult, is gone. The truth underneath is worse than anything they imagined. A life extension experiment poisoned the entire adult population generations ago, and it's still poisoning anyone who reaches puberty. The children aren't children at all. They're centuries old, aging at a fraction of a year every human lifetime, trapped in small bodies with old, patient diseases ticking inside them. As the crew races to build a cure, fear turns the onlys into something closer to a mob, and the ship's own doctor has to test the vaccine on himself before he can prove it works on anyone else. It's bleak enough that when the BBC aired it once in 1970, the complaints came fast, and the episodes simply disappeared from rotation for years. Not banned by decree, banned by silence. Then there's the one everybody remembers. Even people who've never watched a single frame of Star Trek. A captive crew, an alien society playing God with human bodies, and two officers forced by telekinetic puppeteers to move toward each other until their lips meet. It's a few seconds of screen time. It became a fault line in television history. The first interracial kiss broadcast on American network TV. NBC's own executives weren't worried about the kiss itself. They were worried about what stations in the Deep South would do the moment it aired. And here's the part that should surprise you. Almost nobody complained. The backlash executives braced for never really came. America, it turned out, was more ready than the suits in the boardroom gave it credit for. The reaction abroad was colder. When the episode reached the United Kingdom, the BBC simply declined to air it, calling the story too brutal. A reason that satisfied almost no one, because the brutality wasn't really the issue. The kiss was. If that one is remembered for what it represented, the next is remembered for how far it was willing to go. A routine cargo run to a psychiatric facility turns into a hostage situation When the crew arrives to find the asylum already conquered from the inside, running it is a man named Garth, once was Starfleet's most decorated captains, now a shapeshifter convinced he's destined to rule the galaxy. He doesn't threaten his prisoners. He tortures them, methodically, delighting in the unraveling of another human mind-way of collected delights in a rare specimen. At one point, simply to prove a point about power, he murders another inmate without hesitation. By the climax, he's impersonating the captain himself, and the only way to catch him is for his first officer to work out, through pure logic, with no room for error, which man in front of him is real. The BBC decided the madness, the torture, and the casual cruelty were simply too much for family television, and pulled it before it ever aired in the UK. Somehow, an episode with almost no visible violence at all did worse. Set on a doomed planet, it follows a crew as they're subjected to experiments by beings who never fully show what they're doing. The horror lives entirely in the reactions, in the dialogue, in what's implied rather than shown. That restraint should have made it safer for broadcast. Instead, the BBC found it more disturbing than anything with visible blood, and shelved it indefinitely, citing madness, sadism, and disease as more than viewers should be asked to sit with. American audiences loved it. UK fans spent years petitioning the network to reconsider. The answer stayed no for almost 3 decades. It didn't officially air in Britain until 1994. Nearly 30 years after it was made, a quiet reminder that some stories get punished not for shock value, but for making you sit too long with someone else's suffering. By the time the next generation picked up the mantle, the franchise had stopped hiding its willingness to disturb. A parasitic alien conspiracy reaches its climax when an infected officer's head is destroyed by sustained phaser fire. Not implied, not cut away from, but shown, followed by the parasite itself tearing free of the corpse in full, grotesque view. It's the kind of image that belongs in an 80s body horror film, not a family science fiction show, and everyone involved knew it. American broadcasters shuffled it to a later time slot to soften the blow for younger viewers. Canadian stations added a warning before it aired. The BBC didn't bother with either option. They simply refused to air it at all. And the list didn't stop there. A love story between 2 women, groundbreaking simply for existing on mainstream television, got quietly stripped from Southern broadcasts rather than banned outright. A single kiss cut from tape after tape by nervous distributors, even as critics call it one of the franchise's most human hours. A brutal alliance of necessity story became the first Star Trek episode censored specifically for excessive violence, losing 45 seconds of hand-to-hand combat before any network would air it. And when the BBC demanded even more cuts for a UK evening slot, the finished product came back so choppy that viewers complained about the editing itself being the problem. Notice the pattern. It's never really about violence for its own sake, or romance for its own sake, or grief for its own sake. Every single band traces back to the same root cause, the show refusing to let an uncomfortable idea stay comfortable. A kiss that crossed a color line, a love story that crossed a gender line, a body horror sequence that crossed a taste line executives thought television simply couldn't hold. Each time, some version of the same institution looked at the same footage and made the same calculation. Better to cut it than to explain it. But here's where the story turns, because the people who made these episodes weren't reckless. They were patient. Nichelle Nichols, the actress who played Lieutenant Uhura and shared that first interracial kiss, once considered walking away from the show entirely. Before she could, she found herself at an NAACP dinner across the table from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who told her, with real warmth, that Star Trek was one of the only programs he allowed his own children to watch, and that she belonged to something larger than a role on a television set. She stayed. Years later, NASA came calling, and Nichols spent the better part of a decade helping recruit the first women and the first black astronauts into the American space program, a real-world legacy born directly out of a role in network almost censored into non-existence. That's the real revelation hiding underneath every one of these bands. It was never really about a kiss or a corpse or a monster bursting out of a chest. It was about a network trying to decide, episode by episode, how much of the truth an audience could handle, and getting it wrong almost every single time. The Kiss America was supposedly too fragile for barely cause a ripple. The empathy story too disturbing to broadcast sat unaired for 30 years while fans begged for it back. The interracial romance quietly edited out of Southern broadcast became, decades later, one of the moments actors and critics point to as proof the franchise mattered. Every band was a bet against the audience. Almost every bet lost. That's what makes this history worth remembering. Not the shock of what got cut, but the fact that so much of it eventually got proven right. Somewhere between Kirk's forced kiss and a parasite tearing itself free of a Starfleet officer, a science fiction show about the future kept accidentally revealing something about the present. That people were usually braver and readier than the men holding the scissors ever gave them credit for. So when you hear that an episode was banned, don't picture something too dark to be worth watching. Picture something too honest to be comfortable. A story that trusted its audience before the people in charge of the broadcast ever did. Star Trek spent decades daring somebody to look away. Almost every time, it was the network that blinked first.